Again, my name is Alex Fogg. I'm a fisheries biologist with Florida Fish and Wildlife in the Artificial Reef subunit. Particularly, I'm the project manager for the Natural Resource Damage Assessment Northwest Florida Artificial Reef Creation and Restoration Project. So that's a pretty long one, and for the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to be calling that the NRDA project. So to orient you on what we're going to actually be talking about today, I'll first start with a background of this project and where we are today. I'll talk about the project location along Northwest Florida and where these modules are going to be placed. I'll talk about the module specifications and show a few pictures of some of the selected modules for this project. I'll then discuss the human use monitoring aspect of this and some of the methodologies that we hope to employ. There's a expectation with this NRDA project that we do monitor human use, but we're going to hopefully try and answer some other questions in addition to satisfying those requirements. I'll also talk about the current status of this project, which I think a lot of that was probably covered in the panel discussion right before lunch. And lastly, the future plans and closing for this project. So to start with background, what is NRDA? NRDA is the legal process that determines the amount of restoration needed to compensate for loss of natural resources or loss of human use of those natural resources, in this case due to the BP oil spill. And it's important to note that economic damages are not natural resource damages and are handled completely separate from the NRDA project. So more of a timeline, a background since before 2014. Of course, April 2010, the Deepwater oil spill began. A year later, in April 2011, $1 billion was made available for early restoration project implementation. Then 2 years after that, the 5 Northwest Florida counties proposed their artificial reef construction plan. And that map down there at the bottom, it's kind of hard to see here, but that red box is the project location. The next few slides, I'm going to zoom in and show you a little more in depth. So here's a zoomed-in map of that project area. The red dots represent centroids of 48 permitted areas where NRDA reefs are going to be deployed. Now, I specifically mentioned the red dots being centroids because the permitted areas are relatively small. Here's a map here that actually shows the permitted areas on there. If you look really, really close, you can see a number of real small specks. 7 of these sites are the larger sites, and the rest of them are quarter-mile by quarter-mile boxes or smaller. So they are very relatively small sites. It's also important to note that all of these reefs are within 9 miles of shore, which is state waters. But even though they may be only 3 or 4 miles offshore, the closest inlet may be upwards of 25 miles. So in some cases, they are pretty remote. Zooming in a little bit closer into Okaloosa and Walton County, again, you can notice the size of these permitted areas are relatively small. If you look real close to shore, you may see even smaller permitted areas. These are the snorkel reefs, the permitted areas where the snorkel reefs are going to be going, and I'll discuss them in a little more detail here in just a second. So we've classified the permitted areas into really 3 broad classes. The first is the inshore snorkel reefs. 13 of these sites fall into this classification, and as you would expect, these sites are really close to shore. You can swim out to them from shore to access the reefs. Second are the nearshore fish dive reefs. There's 14 of these sites, and they fall between 25 and 65 feet of water. Again, these are relatively close to shore and are easily accessible by kayakers or other small vessels. And lastly, 21 of these sites are offshore fish dive sites. These sites are deeper than 65 feet of water and are a little tougher to get to. You need a larger vessel. Okay, so the number and type of modules that are going to be going into each of these sites really depends on the type of modules that are selected. There is a wide range of modules that you can choose from, but they must fall within these specifications. They need to be between 6 and 20 feet tall. They need to weigh between 2 and 20 tons, and they must be made of reinforced concrete and limestone. There's also permit conditions that you also need to follow. In some cases, in these shallow sites that are 25 feet deep, you can't throw a 20-foot reef in that area. It'll violate the navigational clearance. In addition to this, you are also required to follow the marine life modification, which is a 36-inch opening at the top of the module that allows turtles to escape in the event they find their way inside the module due to scouring. Lastly, they also must be capable of being lowered to the bottom with a crane to prevent damage when they make contact with the bottom, as well as increasing deployment accuracy, especially in the case where modules may be going back to areas where material has already been deployed. These snorkel reefs are a little bit different, though. They are only allowed to be a maximum height of 8 feet. They must have 3 or more concrete and limestone layers, and they're going to be mounted on pilings, which will be embedded into the substrate to prevent movement in areas where there's quite a bit more energy than some of these offshore areas. So a little bit more background. Since 2014, in April 2015, $11.5 million was transferred from Florida DEP onto FWC for project implementation, and shortly after that is when I came on board to manage the project. In January 2016, all construction contracts were awarded, and most recently in September 2016, the first NRDA modules were deployed off of Mexico Beach, so we are underway. And with the construction phase being underway, which is a good thing, we need to look forward to the required human use monitoring portion of this project. To describe human use, we've considered numerous methodologies, and we've done implementing each of these methods. A number of these I'm just going to highlight here and go into depth a little bit more in the upcoming slides. First are creel and axis point surveys, point count and field intercepts, mail and email surveys, aerial surveys, and passive acoustic surveys. So starting off with creel and axis point surveys, we hope to follow similar methodologies as what was done on the East Coast, where FWI scientists were aiming to figure out how many vessels were going out into the Atlantic Ocean to fish for red snapper during their very short red snapper season. And they were actually dealing with 9 different inlets on the Atlantic coast. Fortunately, we have a lot less than that, really only 4 that will be accessing these NRDA reefs, so it seems like a much more manageable feat over here that we can maybe monitor for a longer period of time. Let's see. Additionally, we can go out into the field and actually count vessels that are using these reefs, which is pretty easy. It'll give you an accurate indication of who's using that reef on a given day and a given time. We can also use the information gathered during this method to ground truth some of the vessel detections that we find during our acoustic monitoring portion of our human use monitoring, which will be a few more slides down the road. Next, we have mail and email surveys, which are easy and relatively inexpensive method, especially when you can add them to an existing survey like the Gulf Reef Fish Survey that FWC administers. They send these surveys out to a random selection of saltwater licensed anglers on a monthly basis. And we've actually had 2 questions added to this. The first being, do you ever recreationally fish on artificial reefs? And during the time period, let's say April, when this survey was sent out, did you fish on any artificial reefs? And in all of your folders, you actually have an example of what this survey looks like. And if you want a full copy of this, I can show you that after the talk. So moving on to aerial surveys, you can actually use this method to survey a really large area in a relatively short amount of time. But one of the drawbacks may be due to altitude and your speed, you may not get higher resolution information such as what that boat is doing, or even pinpoint the exact reef a boat is actually fishing on or around. But to test the possibilities of this method, Keith and I actually did a ride-along back in May of 2016 during the opening weekend of red snapper season. And we left out of Destin, Florida, and flew pretty much the entire coast from Destin to Franklin County. And during this time, we counted vessels, and that map down there on the bottom, that red line is our flight path during just one portion of this survey. The blue dots, which may be a little bit tough to see there, are actually boats that we detected and estimated their position, and the real small white dots are known FWC public artificial reefs. Sorry about that. During this time, we actually counted 119 vessels, and 63% of those vessels were associated with artificial reefs. Now, we couldn't necessarily determine exactly which artificial reef that they were fishing on, but we could figure out which permitted area they were in. And this also does not include popular known reefs like the Empire Mica or some of the historic shipwrecks like the Tarpon, because they aren't technically FWC public artificial reefs. So this 63% may be an underestimate. So last but not least, we're using acoustic data loggers to essentially listen for boat engines. This method has been used in the past, specifically in an FWC-funded project a few years ago by Simard and Stallings at University of South Florida, where they actually deployed 8 acoustic data loggers, 4 on artificial reefs and 4 on natural reefs, to look to see if there were differences between visitation on natural and artificial reefs, as well as difference in visitation based on season. And below is also the publication. So we are using the same methods to address the human use monitoring requirements associated with NRDA-funded artificial reefs. The photo on the left down there at the bottom is actually what one of these acoustic data loggers look like. Right now it's gray, but before it's deployed, it's actually painted bright blue with anti-fouling paint to prevent a bunch of growth on the unit itself. And on the right, again, it's kind of small and tough to see, those red dots represent locations where we're going to deploy these acoustic data loggers to monitor boat visitation. Once deployed, these acoustic data loggers will record for 1 minute every 10 minutes, 24 hours a day. And every 3 months, we'll go out there to swap out the batteries and download the data, which will then bring back to the office. And we have a recent new hire that will help us tease out exactly how many boats are being detected at these sites. Currently, 6 of these 13 acoustic data loggers have actually been deployed on the Panhandle just a few weeks ago. The remaining 7 acoustic data loggers will be deployed in the upcoming weeks, weather and schedule dependent. And the big question that we hope to answer, in addition to satisfying the NRDA human use requirements, are what is really influencing artificial reef visitation. There's a whole bunch of other questions that fall underneath this, and I'm happy to talk to you about that after this talk. So moving on into current status, again, you guys have probably heard a lot of these updates in the panel discussion that was a few minutes ago. But Mexico Beach, all construction contracts have been awarded, and about 65% of these modules have actually been deployed. Walton County has selected their consultation service provider, and all of their construction contracts have been awarded. Escambia County has awarded construction contracts for the first phase of 4, and they're hoping to get modules in the water in the near future. Santa Rosa County has selected their vendor for consultation services, and hopefully they'll get moving on particularly their snorkel reef here in the near future. And lastly, Okaloosa and Bay County, they're having some issues with historical resource surveys, and we're hoping to address those in the upcoming months and get them moving as well. So future plans in closing, this spring, 2017, we're hoping to finish up the City of Mexico Beach deployments. We also hope to finish up the acoustic data logger deployments and begin post-deployment monitoring. In the summer, we hope to begin Escambia and Santa Rosa deployments. We also want to develop and finalize the NRDA monitoring contracts between us and the counties. We also want to inform the public about these new reefs, because if no one knows about them, well, no one's really going to use them, and yeah, that's not good. We also want to enlist a team of volunteers to help with a lot of these monitoring methods, get people involved. And lastly, we want to answer the question, who's really using these artificial reefs and how many people are. So with that, I'll field any questions, and thank you all for listening. That's NRDA in a nutshell. Yes, sir. So he asked to describe the volunteer monitoring efforts. As these different methodologies are finalized, we're going to certainly need manpower, especially with things like the point count surveys or the creel surveys, where we're actually going to be counting vessels going in and out of these passes. One person can't do that, especially with four passes, so we're hoping to enlist some help with that. Also with some of the side scan sonar work that we're doing, I didn't really talk much about that in this presentation, but we certainly need assistance with that, as well as actually going out and checking out these reefs as they're going in the water. So that's just a few of the things. Yes, sir.
Are you going to continue with your aerial survey?
That's a good question. There's a lot of logistics that go into the aerial surveys. We're hoping to use them on a limited basis, maybe look at it again when the red snapper season opens again in May to see how it compares to some of the stuff that we found last year. Correct, yes. The vessels that are in transit were not counted. Correct. Yep.
How will your volunteers monitor the vessel traffic?
There'll be data sheets developed. Again, we're still in the planning portion of that monitoring method. They'll essentially sit at the pass and count the boats that are going in and out.
How about video?
Video too. That'd certainly be definitely a method to validate some of that, but someone has to be there to man it because that video camera may walk away. Yes, sir.
And creel surveys, could they be done in conjunction with LAO checkpoints, since the LAO guys are already out there?
Yeah, they could, but they aren't going to be there at all times, and they may be taken up by an inspection. They may be busy dealing with someone and may miss some of the boats that are going in and out. Yes, ma'am. I hope I do.